Welcome all to be here tonight. So thank you for joining us today's event. Thrilled to welcome Professor Daniel Williams for coming from Ohio to deliver the lecture part of the program Christianity Culture. Our program Christianity Culture is offers students, and some of you know, the opportunity to pursue a minor in our department of religious studies, taking a diverse area of courses covering Christian history, theology, practices. By the way, that's it. My name is Vital Marienberg. I'm part of the religious studies department. Alongside also, we have engaging lectures. It's a popular minor. If there are undergrad students that are not here, come to me and we will take care of maybe to enlist you or to other colleagues here. We have to say that this lecture is part of a series, and we are deeply grateful for the ongoing support, generous support of the key donor that helps us run this program, run this series. The contribution made this lecture possible, and it's the continued contribution makes it continue with that. I believe that for the donor and for us, what we intend is to bring very high-level lectures to UNC on different things related to religion and culture. Religion and culture is be widely defined. In a second, I'll say how I define it, why I chose some of these talks. I'm currently the current director of the program, and I decided to focus during my term on contemporary issues, in ways in which religion, particularly Christianity, have really impact on our culture. So, for example, last year, what we had a lecture talking about the impact or the involvement of religious issues in the war in Ukraine. So to show how he spoke about Putin's ideology and religion, all that. So this is something that why I chose to speak about things that impact us and also often impact politics. Today we're eager to delve into how evangelical leaders in this country grapple with the reality in which, despite their success to get at times great political influence, their cultural influence is in some ways waning. The upcoming presidential elections, I think, underscore the significance of the topic, considering that unless a major change happens, we are going to have one of the candidates that is seeking and getting support from evangelicals, while he and they know that he is not part of that. So some kind of coalition that is definitely created. So we'd like to hear how evangelicals play with such issue of importance. This is clearly important for us as citizens, and I think as scholars of religion, religion culture. I had a long, nice talk with Professor Williams just now, and spoke about the thing that I did. And I said that I'm from Jewish background, but I studied Catholicism in the Catholic Institute of Paris because I wanted to study from the Catholics about their religion. And I think always it's important to hear also internal point about a certain religious group. So we spoke that also for him as being related in some very complicated ways with communities like this to explore them, to explain them. I think we are very grateful to have it. Professor Williams, that was trained at Brown University, formerly professor of history at the University of West Georgia, is now a senior fellow at the Ashbrook Center, Ashland University in Ohio. He's a leading scholar of Christian right in this country. This is not my field. When I wanted to hear someone about the Christian right, I started to look online and I found him everywhere. And then I asked some colleagues and says, yes, this is your guy. This is one of the biggest stars, so we are very happy to have him here. His prolific contribution to both to journals such as The Atlantic, New York Times, Washington Post, Christianity Today, and others, also with some books that consider to be authoritative in the field. What I like about the titles of his books, that they are very clear. I like this. So you read them and you know what it's doing. So, for example, the election of Evangelical, Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford in the presidential contest of 1976, or God's Own Party, the making of the Christian right, some of them with Oxford and others, Defend of the Unborn, the pro-life movement before Roe and Wade, and other works. So show how his impact and interest in this issue. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Williams, and forward to hearing.
Well, thank you for coming out, and thank you for the invitation and kind introduction. I'm happy to have this opportunity to talk with you about something that we may think we know something about from the news. I think it's fairly well known among almost everybody, regardless of your relationship to evangelicalism, that Donald Trump's election in 2016 and his campaign in 2020 depended in part on the strong support of white evangelical Protestants. And so, given what you may know from the news about the Christian right, you may think you understand the politics that evangelicals gravitate toward. But you may not have seen this picture or know the context. This is the president of the National Association of Evangelicals in 2009, speaking out strongly on behalf of what was one of the NAA's major issues that year, which is immigration reform in a fairly progressive direction. That is, they wanted to offer a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants who were in the United States. They wanted to offer a more compassionate outreach to people who were trying to get into the United States. And that may be something that comes as a surprise for those of you who know, as I assume most of you do, that if there's one issue that the Republican Party is really focused on this year, it's on tightening border security, cutting off a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants who are in the United States. So what do we make of this? How do we reconcile the fact that the leading organization in the United States that claims to represent evangelical Christians took this particular stance, and yet evangelical Christians have also supported Donald Trump in overwhelming numbers? And so I think that raises some questions that I want to explore today. I want to ask the question, is there an evangelical politics? Why have evangelical Christians made the particular choices that they have, both in the last decade and before that? Are these political choices that they're making driven by leaders from within evangelicalism, like the president of the National Association of Evangelicals, or are they driven by someone else, maybe outside forces or maybe voters at the grassroots who are acting against the wishes of the theological leaders in the movement? And does evangelical theology itself, not the culture, but the theology that evangelicals embrace, does it offer any guidance for political choices, or is this completely just a cultural phenomenon? And finally, what political role should evangelicals play in this era of secularization, as Professor Marienberg mentioned? We are in this era where it seems like the influence, at least the numbers of adherents of any organized religion, and especially Christianity and conservative forms of Christianity, seems to be declining. And so what do we make of that? What part to play in this world of politics might groups of conservative religious believers, including evangelicals, have? So all these questions, while they seem somewhat disparate, are related to a central idea, which is the story of the history of the Christian right and its present place in American politics. Since we have a limited amount of time, and this is a very complicated phenomenon, I'll necessarily be painting with a fairly broad brush. And all of the things that I say, could be probed more deeply, and we could split hairs and issue qualifiers. And I'll be happy to do that in the Q&A if you want to push back on anything. I can certainly elaborate with apologies in advance for trying to issue some fairly sweeping generalizations. But I think in the next 35 minutes or so, I can give you a history of the Christian right that will both touch on some things you may be aware of and also raise some questions that may raise some provocative ideas that you might not have been aware of, and then bring that up to the present and talk about where we are today in 2024, heading into presidential election season. So since I've used the term evangelical quite a few times, I should probably define that. Interestingly enough, most people that we would call evangelical Christians probably don't use that term as their primary identity. So it's not like, say, Catholicism, where if you ask someone, are you a Catholic? If they're a Catholic, they'll tell you they're a Catholic. They might qualify that and say, well, I'm not like this sort of Catholic, but I am a Catholic of this other sort. But with evangelical Christianity, increasingly a number of people are dropping the label. And a lot of people never really had the label to begin with. After all, Christian radio is generally not called evangelical radio, it's generally called Christian radio. And so if you meet an evangelical, someone who could be labeled an evangelical, and they're talking about their religious belief, their primary identity is almost always going to be Christian. That's how they'll describe themselves. And we're using the term evangelical more in the scholarly sense or the media sense to try to describe, okay, well, what type of Christian? Because it does seem like there's a group of people that share similar beliefs that are maybe not like other groups of Christians that we could talk about. Their voting behavior is different, their theological beliefs are different. And so in the late 1980s, one of the premier international scholars of evangelical Christianity, David Bevington, who's actually in England, or was in England, I think he may now be at Baylor, but his background is British, came up with this idea that maybe there are 4 beliefs, here you see 5 because someone added to it, but originally it was 4, and these beliefs were called the Bevington quadrilateral. And he said that if you look at all the movements in the world that could be labeled evangelical, from the 18th century, when this movement is commonly described as beginning in Protestantism in Britain and what would become the United States, the American colonies at the time, all the way up to the present, you could say there are 4 general beliefs that describe most of these people. That is, they believe in the high authority of the Bible as the basis for their doctrine. They don't have a magisterium, unlike, say, Catholicism, where people will say, yes, the Bible's authoritative, but it's not our sole authority. So they strongly adhere to the traditional Reformation doctrine of sola scriptura. They believe in salvation from sin, personal salvation from sin, through Jesus' atoning death on the cross that they believe is received by faith. And they believe in the necessity of that personal conversion or moment of faith that they believe God creates in a person's heart so that they are then able to believe through being what is called born again. So in the 70s especially, but even afterwards, it was common to call evangelical Christians born again Christians. And they generally believe that that conversion experience will change someone, and so that they would then live a sanctified life, a life that has certain behaviors, certain attitudes that are different from those of an unconverted person, and that they will, among those things, they will engage in outreach to others through evangelism and maybe through a quest for social justice. More recently, Thomas Ked, a historian of American evangelicalism, has said, well, we should really add a 5th point to that quadrilateral, the belief in the Holy Spirit's work in the life of the individual Christian, which is implied by some of these beliefs, but not explicitly stated. And together we could say these beliefs are not necessarily unique to evangelicalism, but as a package and in terms of their emphasis, they tend to characterize a group that has given more emphasis to this particular expression of Christianity, these particular Christian doctrines, than any other group of Christians. So I like the Bevington quadrilateral, and I'll be using it. But it's also the case that not every person who accepts these would necessarily feel comfortable being lumped in with the category of evangelicals. In particular, a lot of African-American Protestant Christians have tended to say, well, I subscribe to all these things, but I don't really identify with the evangelical movement. And so commonly we will use the qualifier white evangelical to talk about white evangelicalism in this country. And for the rest of today's talk, that's what I'm going to do, is to focus on the experiences and beliefs of white evangelicals. We use that term white evangelical loosely these days because if you go to almost any evangelical megachurch, you'll find it's not, even if it's predominantly white, it's not lily white. There might be 15% or more of the congregants who would not identify as white. And so even white evangelicalism is a little bit problematic, but we could say that if we're looking at a movement of people that historically has come from white American Protestantism and that is generally characterized by these beliefs, that's the type of evangelicalism that we're describing. So with all of that as kind of a long prelude, we can dive into this story of how have these people, how American evangelicals express themselves politically. If we say that this movement developed in the 18th century as an outgrowth of American Protestantism at the time, we can say that it really first began to manifest itself politically in the early 19th century Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening was characterized by religious revivals that emphasized that born-again aspect that was so important to the Bevington quadrilateral, this idea of conversion. And I would say that nearly every evangelical group that has become politically active has tended to place a strong emphasis on individual conversion as the ultimate way to change behavior at the individual level and at the societal level. At the same time, though, some of these evangelicals said that this changed life that they were asking people to lead as Christians should manifest itself in some changed behavior that had political ramifications. So among many Northern evangelicals in the mid-19th century, anti-slavery advocacy, along with temperance advocacy that ultimately had a political dimension that led to the prohibition of alcohol, first at the state level and then nationwide, was part of this. Now, for Southern evangelicals, on the issue of slavery, at least, they took a very different trajectory. So evangelicalism itself was not uniformly anti-slavery by any means. But nevertheless, there were political campaigns that came out of the Second Great Awakening that were manifestations of this fourth principle of the quadrilateral. That is, if there's going to be a sanctified life, then if there's going to be social justice, then maybe that has a political meaning as well as an individual meaning, even if the primary means of societal change is going to come through that divine spark, through individual conversion. Most of these evangelicals, in fact, almost all of them, believed in a 19th century Protestant American view of the relationship of church and state. That is, they objected to the idea of established churches. They did not want the United States to have the equivalent of a Church of England, to give special preference to any denomination. And at the same time, they believed that there should be a general Protestant moral influence on American law. So they supported things like devotional Bible reading in the public schools. And they were very comfortable with moral legislation that was based on Christian principles, whether that had to do with the evangelical opposition to alcohol at the time, or whether it had to do with slavery or any number of other moral issues, some of which are sort of forgotten today, like campaigns against state lotteries that some evangelicals led. But all of those had to do with this idea of a generically Protestant moral influence. And we'll see that coming back in the 20th century. Now, in the late 19th century, there was a split in American Protestantism that didn't really become fully evident until the early 20th century, but it kind of began at the end of the 1800s. And it took what had been a mostly evangelical American Protestantism and set one course of people on a different trajectory that became known as mainline Protestantism or liberal Protestantism or ecumenical Protestantism, depending on your label, that embraced the social gospel. And this still exists today. In fact, when I was walking around the UNC campus in downtown Chapel Hill today, I passed a number of old Protestant churches like University Methodist Church, University Presbyterian Church. And I guarantee you that those churches at some point experienced this split and embraced the social gospel side of things. And in recent years, the membership numbers of most of those denominations have declined a bit. Some of those denominations have split even further, most recently the Methodist Church in the last few years. But originally, in the early 20th century, those churches that embraced the more liberal side ended up with the dominant influence in the United States, the dominant political influence, even in some cases, at least in northern cities, maybe even the dominant membership numbers. And this group of people was very political. They believed that the kingdom of God was not something that they were waiting for in the future to be delivered from heaven, but rather something that would be worked out in the practice of social betterment and social justice. And so many of these people developed a very strong view of the equation between American democracy and Christian principles, that American democracy depended on foundation of Christianity, however liberal that might be, but nevertheless still very much Christian in name and in identity with what they view as the principles of Jesus. Their religious opponents, who eventually become known as fundamentalists and then later evangelicals, did not take this view, but nevertheless, many of them did remain more politically active than they're given credit for. So some of the people that I would identify with the less theologically liberal view at the time would be people like William Jennings Bryan, who was a Democrat. He was a strong believer in democracy of the common man, as he would have put it at the time in those gendered terms. Also, toward the end of his life, embraced the anti-evolution cause. And in fact, that's what he gave the last 3 years of his life to, was trying to defend the right of local culturally conservative communities and culturally conservative states to outlaw the teaching of evolution in public schools. Another late 19th century evangelical was Frances Willard, who was president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And most of these people who would have embraced these causes would have been people who still believed in the Bevington Quadrilateral. They still would have said, we believe in individual conversion as really the way to change society. But nevertheless, there are things we can do politically that would create a better society and that would create better conditions for the transmission of the Christian faith. The reason that some fundamentalists embraced the anti-evolution cause was because they believed that the teaching of evolution was undermining the Christianity that they believed was essential for a civilized society. And the reason that some people embraced the anti-alcohol campaign was because they believed that alcohol was destroying the basis for a just society, that the key to alleviating poverty, the key to protecting the family, protecting women and children, was to restrict alcohol. In the 1940s, evangelicalism reorganized. There were a number of fundamentalists who believed that their cause had really become too caught up in the politics of anti-evolution campaigns and in separatism from liberal denominations, and they wanted to see a change that would make evangelicalism more culturally relevant. And so these people created the National Association of Evangelicals, which today has about 40 member denominations. So it's reasonably large. It's not quite as large as, say, the National Council of Churches, but it is a fairly prominent organization. And from the beginning, this organization took some political stances. In particular, it was very strongly anti-communist because it viewed communism as an attack on religion in general and on the Christian faith in particular. So if the ultimate cause of evangelical Christians was spreading the gospel throughout the world and making converts to the gospel, then any form of government that restricted freedom of religion, they believed, was a real problem. They also, though, believed in preserving a Christian influence in the United States. And perhaps the best known evangelical of the mid-20th century was Billy Graham, who came out of both Southern and Northern evangelical circles. As you know, most of you know probably, he was originally from North Carolina, but he was educated at Wheaton College in Illinois, which was really the center of Northern evangelicalism at the time. And very nicely, I think, fused Southern evangelicalism, particularly the Southern Baptist form of evangelicalism, with this Northern evangelicalism. And as far as Graham's politics were concerned, they were moderately Republican for the most part and strongly anti-communist. And he was especially interested in finding figures in government that he believed would lead a religious revival. He believed that Dwight Eisenhower was one of those figures. And he had a fairly strong spiritual influence on Eisenhower, helping to direct him to a church in Washington that he thought would be a good theological fit for him, encouraging him to issue proclamations that referenced God, that referenced even Christianity more specifically. And he viewed Eisenhower, as he said repeatedly, as leading that sort of religious revival. So when Eisenhower signed into law legislation that would add the phrase "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance, that would make "In God We Trust" a national motto, evangelicals, as well as some non-evangelical Christians in the United States, cheered. This was what they believed could defend the nation against communism and could preserve the nation. And many mid-20th century evangelicals began adopting theology that would fit very nicely in what later would be called Christian nationalism. And this theology was that the United States was originally a Christian nation. And it was founded by Christians according to this view. It was founded on Christian principles. And it had repeatedly strayed from this event. And by coming back to it, the nation would be preserved. In fact, the nation's survival, long-term survival, required it to be Christian. If it strayed too far from its Christian roots, it would experience God's judgment in some way, maybe very directly, or maybe sort of indirectly, maybe in terms of a social breakdown as people strayed from Christian principles. And that theology was fairly well developed even by the 1950s. It was also tied very much to the home. The idea was that if the family experienced breakdown, it would lead to societal breakdown, which would lead to national breakdown. So all these things I think were present in the 50s, but they came to the fore in the early 70s in a new way, as Graham developed an unprecedentedly close alliance with an American president, Richard Nixon. That is, never before had someone who was overtly evangelical developed such a strong religious political alliance where he would meet regularly, even weekly, with Nixon's re-election team and campaign team in 1972, advising them on how to reach out to evangelicals, and someone who featured Nixon fairly prominently in his revivals, because Graham believed that Nixon could provide spiritual leadership to the country in opposition to the counterculture and in opposition to the negative social trends that he saw at the time. Now, of course, Graham was disappointed. So were a lot of evangelicals who found in 1974 that maybe Nixon wasn't quite the person that they thought he was when they voted for him in overwhelming numbers in 1972. Even though 84% of white evangelical voters, by at least one estimate, voted for Nixon in 1972, there was a small group called Evangelicals for McGovern that opposed Nixon. And these people, like Ron Sider and Jim Wallace, were people who were opposed to the Vietnam War. And they argued that if Jesus's teachings were about concern for the poor, and if Jesus was a Prince of Peace, then people really shouldn't be supporting Richard Nixon or the Republican Party. That was a fairly small minority voice in evangelicalism at the time. After Nixon's resignation, a number of evangelicals at Christianity Today, which was the magazine Billy Graham had founded, and other Christian magazines at the time, like Eternity magazine, took a step back and said, clearly this country has gone off the rails. Clearly there's a lot of moral decay in the country. But maybe what we need is not a partisan alliance, but rather a quest for someone who would be a genuine Christian, who would be in the White House. Now, interestingly enough, these evangelicals did not agree in the election of 1976 on who that Christian should be. Nearly all magazine editors at the time, nearly all Christian magazine editors and Christian journalists at the time, people like Carl Henry, other magazine editors of places like Christian Life, Eternity, Christianity Today, nearly all of them agreed that what they needed was a religious revival within politics that would be led by a Christian in the White House. But some of them supported Ford and some of them supported Jimmy Carter. In fact, evangelicals were evenly split. The majority in the South supported Carter, the majority in the North supported Ford. Both Ford and Carter could make some legitimate claims, I think, to the evangelical vote. Carter, of course, being very obviously a Southern Baptist who had a born-again experience. Ford, though, as someone who had long represented a predominantly or heavily Calvinist district in Grand Rapids, Michigan, was very popular with a number of Northern evangelicals, particularly those associated with what at the time was known as Calvin College, now is Calvin University. And someone whose own son, Michael, was a student at the Evangelical Seminary, Gordon-Conwell Seminary. And Ford had kind of a quiet Episcopal faith that seemed to be genuine, if not necessarily something that he wanted to wear on his sleeve. And so the evangelical vote was split, but the evangelical criteria for choosing a politician seemed to be relatively uniform. That would change, though, over the next 4 years, because a significant number of evangelicals felt like Carter, the born-again Southern Baptist, did not necessarily change American culture by being in the White House. Carter's own evangelical beliefs about politics involved a traditional Baptist suspicion of church-state alliance. And so he believed that Christianity should affect his politics, but not so much in terms of the particular issue positions that he took, more in terms of his personal integrity and his style of governing. A number of evangelicals, though, believed that the nation was in a moral crisis that affected the family. And so this was manifest in a number of changes that had taken place between 1965 and 1975. Between 1965 and 1975, the divorce rate doubled in the country. It went from 1 out of every 4 marriages ending in divorce to 1 out of every 2 marriages. Public opinion polls showed that public opinion on premarital sex changed, where a majority of Americans in 1965, even a majority of college students in 1965, said that premarital sex was a sin. By 1975, a majority of Americans said it's okay. The gay rights movement had been pretty much unknown to any American in 1965, except in a very small isolated circles. By 1975, it was fairly prominent, fairly well known. The American Psychiatric Association, other associations had reversed their position on homosexuality during that time. So there were a lot of different changes, and of course Roe v. Wade as well, that had taken place during this time. And so a number of evangelicals said, something serious is wrong with the country. What is it? Francis Schaeffer, who was a leading evangelical theologian and cultural apologist, who was a missionary in Switzerland, but had grown up in Pennsylvania, produced some best-selling evangelical books in the mid to late 1970s that tried to interpret what was happening in the culture. And he provided a new language for evangelical Christians to talk about the cultural changes that they found so objectionable. One of the things that he did was to say that abortion was a serious national sin. And he attributed that to the Supreme Court's decision in Roe v. Wade. It wasn't just that abortion was taking place, he said. What was really shocking about the whole thing was that the Supreme Court had simply decided, with a new novel interpretation of the Constitution in his view, that an entire class of persons could be written off as non-persons, as essentially irrelevant, not protected by the Constitution. Of course, if you believe in fetal personhood, then that argument makes sense. This wasn't an argument that Schaeffer came up with himself. It was an argument that he took from Catholic thinkers who had been active in the abortion cause long before he was. But he also linked this to something larger. This was a more original contribution. He said that there was a larger secular humanism out there that was morally relativistic, and that saw, instead of accepting unchanging moral standards, it accepted the idea that whatever was best for society at the time, whatever was best for humanity, could essentially be justified. At least that was the way that he interpreted this. That was dangerous. And all of these things together, all these evils that evangelicals talked about, were linked together by this secular humanist view. So abortion, changes in sexual behavior, divorce, all of these things were tied to a national rejection of God. And so evangelicals began linking two things that I think were really quite separate, but in their mind were fused. That is the secularization of the nation and the sexual revolution. So secularization of the nation was manifest, they would say, in things like the 1962 and 1963 school prayer and Bible reading decisions, where school prayer, devotional school prayer and devotional Bible reading were no longer allowed in public school classrooms. And evangelicals began saying, well, maybe kicking God out of public school, as they would have phrased it at the time, was something that then opened the door to all of these other negative cultural changes. People no longer had a moral framework that was theistic. And so in fighting abortion and fighting some of these other things, evangelicals began adopting Christian nationalist interpretations. Christian nationalism was something that in terms of a label was rather recent, but I think the idea was very much present. So I'm using the term maybe a little anachronistically, but I don't think it's misguided at all, because I do think this was a form of Christian nationalism, where people were saying there was a national moral decline, and this moral decline is related to the abandonment of Christianity. How do you get Christianity back in the public square. You fight not so much for born-again Christians in the White House, who haven't done a very good job of protecting the nation from secular humanism. You instead focus on particular issues. What you need are people who are going to change the culture by supporting legislation or supporting constitutional amendments or supporting a change in the Supreme Court that will lead to restrictions on abortion, that will lead to a rollback of the gay rights movement. And that was the premise behind the Moral Majority. The Moral Majority was an evangelical Christian political organization founded in 1979 that adopted the new stance of a political interest group. That is, no longer were they interested in electing Christian candidates to office, although they'd be happy to do that if they could, but their primary interest was in electing politicians to office who were pledged to the particular issue positions of the Christian right, whether they were Christian or not. And so the Moral Majority had a number of issues that it was concerned about. 10 issues were especially important to them. I won't go through all of those. Those included, in addition to abortion and opposition to gay rights, there was also support for Israel. There was also opposition to communism and support for nuclear arms buildup. There was a school prayer amendment that they wanted, quite a number of different things, but all of it was tied to this particular issue agenda of evangelicalism that was related to the campaign against secular humanism. Now, what's interesting about the Christian right is there were several organizations, it wasn't just the Moral Majority, but several organizations that argued for similar things. And if you look at the leaders of each of these organizations in about 1980, they were all people who were born at about the same period of time. And I think that's no accident, because these were people who had come of political age during the Eisenhower era. They had adopted that view of the fusion between God and country. And they had then lived through what they viewed as very negative changes of the late 1960s and early 1970s as a standpoint of people that were a little bit too old to actually be on college campuses at the time, but were observing from a distance, raising their kids at a time when they believed the country was headed in the wrong direction. And so for them, protecting the family, protecting their kids, protecting the nation's Christian identity, and arguing against the sexual revolution so that the nation could be preserved, were all part of the same package. And so this created the Christian right of the early 1980s. Now, this story, I guess, is fairly well known, but what I want to look at is this question very briefly. I want to look at this question of who was part of this Christian right? Is it evangelicals in general, or was it a particular group? Now, traditionally, when we've told the story, we've tended to tell the story, and I've been one of those people in the past as well. We tend to tell the story, well, it's evangelicals in general. Sure, a few people were not part of it, but after all, 2/3 of evangelicals voted for Ronald Reagan's election in 1980. 80% did so in 1984. But if you look at this map, there's something interesting going on. And that is, when you look at the blue Democratic votes in 1980, they're coming disproportionately from those very parts of the country you think would be most evangelical. Now, so where do we get the figure that 2/3 of evangelicals voted for, 2/3 of white evangelicals voted for Reagan, which is true. I think that's what public opinion polling at the time measured. Well, you look at a very red Birmingham, Alabama, right in the middle of Alabama. You look at some very red suburbs of Atlanta in Georgia and elsewhere. And what you will see here in this map is a suburban, moderately educated white evangelicalism, overwhelming going for Reagan, but a rural, less college educated population sticking with Jimmy Carter. And this is something that I think I completely missed in my first book on the Christian right, God's Own Party, which was published in 2010. We were not looking for this because the story of the Christian right that we were telling was the better known story of the evangelical leaders. But I think when we look at the president, what's happening with Trump, what I can now say is that I think the evangelical leadership was not controlling as large a constituency as what they thought. That the Christian right spoke very directly to a generation of suburban, white, college-educated, or moderately educated evangelicals who bought into this idea that the Republican Party would champion their agenda and linked that to the ideal of free enterprise, of rolling back government intrusion into the lives of the family and into churches and church schools. All of that was tied with the Reagan agenda. And to be fair, eventually this Reagan agenda did appeal to people across the board, not just evangelicals, but as you can see in 1984, enough Americans to win most of the country overwhelmingly. It was definitely a landslide for Reagan. But the more recent trajectory with the Christian right has involved that particular split, I would say, the discrepancy between suburbia and the rural constituency. Now, very quickly, actually, maybe I'll skip this because in the interest of time, I wanted to actually talk a little bit about where we are today with this split. In the 1980s, the moral majority got a lot of press. It was viewed as a very powerful coalition, and even more so, I think, and more deservedly so in the 1990s, Ralph Reed and Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition gained a lot of press. And at that point, over the course of the 1980s, in this evangelical agenda, abortion rose to the fore as not just one of the issues that evangelicals were concerned about, but the most important issue that evangelicals were concerned about. And this reinforced their commitment to the Republican Party because they were seeing abortion through the lens that Schaeffer had talked about, that is, through the lens of the Supreme Court. So opposing abortion for evangelicals meant voting for presidents and senators who would then confirm the justices that would be likely to overturn Roe. And ultimately that strategy was successful, although it took much longer than many evangelicals wanted, but ultimately that strategy, as all of you know, did succeed in overturning Roe v. Wade in 2022. So it was a powerful coalition builder. And people like Ralph Reed, deservedly, I think, attracted a lot of press attention because they were able to change Republican Party organizations at the local level, to move the Republican Party as a whole into conformity with the Christian rights agenda. And throughout the 1990s, this conservative political culture was transmitted not just through these organizations, but also through Christian talk radio. People like James Dobson, for example, who had millions of listeners to his Focus on the Family program, could equate evangelical Christianity, evangelical Christian theology, and the culture of focusing on a particular vision of the family with conservative politics. And it was such a powerful vision that even when the original Christian right organizations disintegrated, as the moral majority did in 1989 and as the Christian Coalition would in 2001, evangelicals could actually remain committed Republicans and even grow in their commitment to the Republican Party, even without the same centralized leadership. So by the end of the 90s, or very beginning of the 21st century, there was no longer a Christian right organization that had the same clout as the Christian Coalition had in the 1990s. There were Christian right organizations, but they were not the primary venue by which people were discovering the necessity of voting Republican if they wanted to preserve the nation and preserve their faith. Also during that time, people began to shift from thinking just that they were preserving the nation to thinking that maybe the primary concern that they had was preserving their own religious liberty. As they began to feel frustrated that they were losing the culture war, as they constantly believed they were doing, they became ever more anxious that maybe their own religious liberty was in danger. And that really took off in the 1990s, but it continued into the 21st century and became more pronounced. Indeed, I would argue evangelicals did have reason to believe they were losing the culture war, although progressives would also say they were winning some of the political fights. But if you look at acceptance of same-sex marriage over the course of the first decade of the 21st century, if you look at a lot of the other things that they were concerned about, proliferation of pornography, there were plenty of reasons to believe that they were not winning the culture wars. And yet that would only increase their commitment to the Republican Party, because as they continued to lose ground, they became more dependent than ever on politicians that they believed were their last hope of maybe if the nation couldn't be preserved, at least their own right to practice their faith unimpeded could. Now, during this time, most people who were looking at evangelicalism from a critical lens from the outside, journalists, were saying that the country, if it was experiencing a political danger, this political danger was coming from within evangelicalism. It was that the Christian right was theocratic. It did not believe in democracy in the way that most people believed in democracy, they said. And the nation was in danger of being taken over by these theocrats. That's not entirely what critics of evangelical Christianity are saying today. In fact, today, the line that you're more likely to get from books like Tim Alberta's recent book, The Kingdom and Power of Glory, is that evangelicalism has been taken over by an outside political force. That the most dangerous political force in America is no longer coming, I mean, evangelicals may be championing it, but they didn't invent it. So what has happened? How did we move from, in the last 15 years, from saying that, for people who say this is a danger, from saying, well, this is unique to evangelicalism, and the problem is the evangelicals are ruining American politics, to saying evangelicals have been co-opted by this larger political problem that's destroying us. And I think the answer is that we have been caught up in a growing class divide between people who want to support an establishment and those who want to dismantle or destroy that establishment. And that divide can be seen partly in education, in this educational divide. So in the 1980s and 1990s, people with college degrees, whites with college degrees, were much more likely to be Republican than Democratic. That changed in the 21st century. And at the same time, a group of people who were more likely to be Democrats in the past, those without a college degree, have become more likely to be Republican. That's just one measure of this divide, but it's a very effective measure. If you look at the states that are ranked by education, if you look at the 15 most educated, if you look at the 10 most educated states, those with the highest percentage of college degrees, all 10 of those are firmly blue Democratic states. If you look at the 15 states of people who, the 15 least educated states, that is the percentage that have the lowest percentage of people who've completed college education, all but one of those is a Republican leaning state. So there's a new educational divide. There's a rural versus urban divide. It can be expressed in various ways, various measures. But what we're essentially seeing is the rapid migration of people who once were Republican, who tended to be supportive of an educational economic establishment, moved into the Democratic Party. And a migration of people who were less likely to feel connected to the establishment, moving into the Republican Party. So if you look at the differences in these two Bush elections, 1988, when George H.W. Bush ran against a Massachusetts governor, to 2004, when George W. Bush, the son, ran against a Massachusetts senator. So I'm trying to pick two elections where you kind of have the same issues on the table, more or less. You can see what has happened, that New England became much more blue, Democratic, and the South and rural areas of the Midwest became much more red, Republican during that period. And you can see this measured in so many ways. You can see this educational divide measured in who supported President Barack Obama when he first ran for president in 2008. And so all of that came to a head in 2016 when a group of people who had been predominantly following the Republican Party but didn't have a dominant voice in this, upended politics by using their primary votes to nominate a candidate and then finally elect that candidate who did not represent either the Christian right or the Republican Party establishment. And so Trump was able to capitalize on a growing anti-establishment distrust of many people in the Democratic Party who were coming from predominantly rural areas or from less educated backgrounds, or in some way felt outside of the establishment. Now, what about the Christian right? Well, the Christian right found itself sort of caught in the middle of all this because evangelicals as a whole are less likely to be college educated than the general population, and much more likely to be Southern. On the other hand, the Christian right had been very suburban, and it had a limited hold on those rural votes, even well after the time that it got organized. And so you can see in 1992, much of the rural South was still moderately supportive of the Democratic Party, even though the Christian right was strongly opposed to Bill Clinton. But that would change over the course of the 90s, not so much because of the Christian right, but because of other forces like maybe talk radio or other things. And so you can see this, you can kind of see the country going predominantly red between 1992 and 2000. The actual votes the popular vote during that time did not change very much. In fact, Al Gore won more popular votes than Bill Clinton had. But you can see the electoral votes are shifting, and they're particularly shifting in some rural areas as more rural states are joining an increasingly monolithic Republican coalition. And that has only increased since then. So I was trying to find, okay, what would be a predominantly white rural county in North Carolina that I could use for some local analysis? And you could really pick any county that's predominantly white, less educated, incomes below the median average in the US. And but I happen to pick this Montgomery County, but it shows this phenomenon. Every election becomes more Republican. And my prediction would be 2024, we're going to see more than 66% of the vote going for Trump if Trump is on the ballot, which appears highly likely. So the Christian right saw all of this, and they didn't necessarily invent the Trump phenomenon. They were anti-establishment, but not as anti-establishment as this Republican populist force. So they found themselves caught off guard in 2016. And the Christian right leaders, or the evangelical leaders at the time, had different reactions. Russell Moore, who was president of the primary political arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Convention, came out strongly against Trump and never backed down. He's been a consistent never Trumper. In fact, he left the Southern Baptist Convention finally because he couldn't stand his politics. He's always been a Republican. He's very conservative on all the social issues that the Christian right is conservative on, but didn't want to see the Christian right abandon what he believed was its view of character mattering in politics. Al Mohler, president of the Southern Baptist Convention's largest seminary, Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, did not vote for Trump in 2016. I think he probably voted third party, but did vote for Trump in 2020 and described himself as a reluctant Trump voter who has since become more overtly committed to the Trump version of the Republican Party. And finally, we have a few people like Franklin Graham, who were early buyers into the Trump campaign. Then there were a large number of others like James Dobson, who didn't support Trump in the primaries in 2016, but came around to give him strong support after he promised judicial appointments. And so what you can see, I think, in all of this is that most Christian right leaders were caught a bit off guard by Trump. But many of them came around to supporting him because they saw him as a vehicle to accomplish the issue-based agenda that they had always had. A much larger group of grassroots voters inside and out of churches, most of whom identified in some loose ways evangelical, but many did not, saw Trump as their anti-establishment hero, the person who would take on the establishment that they hated, who would drain the swamp, so to speak, and to use his own words. And a minority of evangelicals, like Russell Moore, have felt politically homeless. And so what I think we're seeing is the fracturing of American evangelicalism. Now, if we can take current political opinion polls as our basis for kind of deciding what the fractures will be, we can say that since the vast majority of evangelicals, some 60% of people who would line up as evangelicals today, are coming from the South. And since it tends to be it's a coalition that's two-thirds of which lacks a college degree, we could say that it's not too surprising that the majority of white evangelicals are going to end up pretty strongly in the Trump camp. That's what I would expect, and with the future Republican Party. But a minority of evangelicals, including some of those who traditionally were part of that 78% of evangelicals voting Republican, are going to be like More and Christianity Today magazine and Wheaton College and the National Association of Evangelicals, and try to pull back a bit and try to create maybe some sort of alternative political coalition or a political coalition. And so what does that mean for evangelicals today? I think I would say that evangelicalism has generally not offered a strong political theology that we could say is a full-orbed political theory that could provide a basis for governance. It's rather tend to be driven by single-issue campaigns and by Christian nationalism. And evangelicalism has always had an uneasy relationship between its political views and its emphasis on conversion. If the ultimate way to change society is through conversion, then what is the place of politics in that? Evangelicals have had a difficult time answering that question. Generally, because of that strong emphasis on personal conversion as the way to transform society, evangelical politics has often been suspicious of institutions and state authority, except when enforcing principles of individual morality. And it's only because of its fusion with Christian nationalism, which is not perhaps most authentically evangelical idea, that it has become so wrapped up in politics. And yet its Christian nationalist campaigns have ended up aligning itself, getting the movement caught up in something that I would argue didn't originate from within evangelicalism, but is an outside force that's been maybe congruent with some version, some culturally rural version of evangelicalism, but didn't really originate from within evangelicalism in the way that we might say is an authentically evangelical politics. But I do think that despite this negative assessment, I do think that evangelical theology does offer a basis for a type of politics that has perhaps been underexplored. And that's a vision of politics not as an evangelical voting bloc to change the country, but in keeping with evangelicals' individual emphasis on conversion and sanctification, would see political choices on the individual level as a way for people to show love toward their neighbor. So instead of saying evangelicals as a whole will vote for Trump or vote against Trump, we'd rather say that individual evangelicals can take their view of Christian principles into politics and seek to love their neighbor, perhaps in ways that differ from those of other evangelicals. And I think that's where people like the editors of Christianity Today magazine are coming to today as they become, in this current political moment, this moment in which the magazine is now dominated by never Trumpers, dominated now by this view that maybe evangelicals in some way feel politically homeless, and that perhaps a minority of evangelicals can rediscover an earlier pre-1950s politics that no longer emphasizes the evangelical voting bloc, but emphasizes the importance for each individual evangelical believer to approach politics with discernment and with love for neighbor in a pluralist society. I'll stop there and I'll be happy to take questions.
I'd like to start by complimenting you and thanking you. It was a brilliant presentation. I don't think I ever really such an historical and contemporary overview that I found to be brilliant. I really thank you. That being said, I have quite a few questions or quite a few remarks, quite a few arguments.
Okay.
I'll start with the very beginning of definition of evangelicalism and where it started, and I agree. You put a premium on revivalism and the Second Great Awakening in America. I think that it would be a mistake not to look at the British context in spite of the major differences. And I think it's not a coincidence. According to David Debbie, the evangelical movement started in the English-speaking world in the second part of the 18th century. Yeah, and reached I would say won the day, at least outside of Britain, in the 19th century. And I think you have to look at the British. Many of the major churches that thrived with revivalism and evangelicalism in 19th century America, Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, started in Britain, the 17th and 18th centuries, certainly the 16th, but Presbyterians, but those are British movements that came to America and reconstructed themselves and thrived here. And there's been so much exchange already in the first Great Awakening. There were preachers who moved. Already in the 19th century, we didn't yet have jet planes. For an American preacher, revivalist, to really make it was to also go to Britain and succeed in drawing crowds of thousands there. So that's a remark. The second remark is that you bought David Bevington's definition of evangelicalism, which on the whole I agree with, but I think that it would be a mistake to just leave it on the theological level. I think that in defining evangelicalism in America of the 20th century, of the late 20th century, early 21st century, to overlook the cultural component, which later, I think you show political standing, but you can also show political and cultural choices, I would call it. Day-to-day choices. What do those people stand for? How do people live their lives? You can recognize, for the most part, evangelical church, which is giving a look at the membership, at the people who are there. And I think that if you overlook that component, which will have to be defined, not easily, it's much easier to define those who emphasize personal conversion experience of being born again in Christ, or as Billy Graham put it, establishing a personal relationship with Jesus. It's much more difficult to put an emphasis or to include a conservative proponent of the conservative Victorian values. I'm saying proponents, I'm not saying practitioners. Sorry for taking so much time and energy doing that. So that's second remark. I think that would be the most controversial. You pointed out there that there were evangelical leaders in the early 2000s who were actually for immigrants' rights. I think that this also calls into attention the fact that many of those undocumented immigrants who come from Latin American countries are either evangelical or they become evangelical in America. I think I don't think people would have stood for them. So again, this was very evident in the George W. Bush administration. I'm not sure that there would be the same goodwill if those people are totally opposed to evangelicalism. And
to answer Miguel, or answer other also graduate students and
yeah, do you want to
I have a little bit more.
okay, I guess if you want to give a little bit more.
I can go on and on.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm leaving it there.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm well aware of the continued debates, lots of debates, scholarly debates about the Bevington quadrilateral. I tend to be more in the camp of defending it rather than those who would attack it. But I acknowledge some of the issues. I do think that the Bevington, even if you adopt the Bevington quadrilateral, it doesn't rule out some of the other things. I think though that the difference would be that I would start with the Bevington quadrilateral and then say, which groups of people do you think conform to all of these beliefs who are part of white Protestantism in America that you would say are not evangelical? And my own view is I don't think you'll come up with any groups at all who would be left out of the evangelical story with the Bennington quadrilateral. So the Bennington quadrilateral will get you to the same position, I think, as what you're describing. Now, sure.
But you'll miss something. You'll miss something in understanding who those people are and what they stand for and how they run their religious and personal lives.
Well, so Bennington quadrilateral doesn't directly describe where people are going to end up on the political spectrum or the cultural spectrum. But I do think it's good to, as a definition for which groups are we talking about, as a way to approach it. And then, sure, I mean, if you want to come up with, one of the reasons that the Bennington quadrilateral has stood the test of time to the extent that 30 years is the test of time. But the reason that it has, I would argue, is because nobody's been able to come up with a better definition. And in fact, the opponents of the Bennington quadrilateral, I think, would concede the point. They would what they would say is that there is no definition that's needed because we're talking about different groups. They're saying Jonathan Edwards' First Great Awakening is not the same group as the Southern Baptist Convention. They would say we don't need to put them in the same category. And that what we're defining would be this much narrower group. I mean, by definition, when you say, Victorian values, you already were sort of excluding Jonathan Edwards in the 18th century awakening, unless they're being a bit anachronistic. So, Bennington was trying to say that the way that evangelicals tell their own story is to see this continuity from the 18th century to the present. And I think most of the opponents of the Bennington quadrilateral would say, there is no story there. There's an imagined story maybe, but there is no historical story, because I don't think if there was a way to lump all of those groups together, with a short definition like the Bennington quadrilateral, someone would come up with it. But you're welcome to try. If you do, want to define people culturally, I think
I would add the cultural.
Yeah, you could. I think I think it's definite. I think we definitely need to talk about the cultural setting in which these ideas are expressed. So, one might say, well, I believe in the theological principles here, but then we have to acknowledge the fact that we're not just shaped by abstract theology, we're shaped by lived experience, by the particular cultural expression. And, I very much believe in that. And, was trying to show that in terms of, what if these beliefs today are predominantly found in the South and rural areas of the country, that tells us something about the larger context that we need to look at. Other questions?
Yeah, there's students, other members.
Well, maybe I'll just pick up on what you were just saying, because one thing I was thinking about, and I'd like to hear you maybe say a little bit more about, is the role of race in a lot of these politics. Because of course, I mean, looking at Jerry Falwell and thinking about the rise of the religious right after school desegregation in the 60s and 70s, which seemed to fuel a lot of it. And then, especially more recently, the kind of reaction to the election of Obama.
Right.
I mean, what would you think about how that fits?
Yeah. So, Jerry Falwell was definitely a segregationist for part of his life. And we could argue about the second half of his life, whether he was or not. I mean, he definitely changed some things, but moved toward a ostensibly colorblind conservatism that reinforced racial divisions in its own way. So there's no question about that. And certainly many of his constituents would have come from a similar mindset. I think there is a dominant narrative or a common narrative with the Christian right that really drills down on race as the answer to everything. Randall Balmer is the major leader in that particular school of thought, has been very influential. There are a number of scholars, not just myself, but a number like Aaron Dochek and others who really try to push back against that narrative to a certain extent. And what I would say is, I've thought about this a lot over the years, and I think the best way to look at, the way that I would look at it is that I do not view these other issues that I talked about as a smokescreen for race, which is oftentimes how Randall Balmer's view in its most extreme forms is presented, like his famous Politico article about abortion being just a smokescreen for this real issue of defending segregated schools. And I think there are many reasons to believe that it's not just a smokescreen. It would not have had the enduring power had it just been a smokescreen. But what I would say is that the way in which these issues were conceptualized by whites and not by African Americans, including those who are opposed to abortion, for example, tells us something about the way that people in this coalition conceived of race. In fact, I would say that what made the Christian right possible in the early 70s was a shift away from overt segregation to colorblind conservatism. Had that shift not taken place, I don't believe the Christian right would have originated as such a strong force in suburbia in the way that it did. Had Jerry Falwell remained an unrepentant segregationist, excluding blacks from his church and school, he would not have become the leader of the moral majority. But by embracing colorblind conservatism, people also linked that to a lot of other issues in the family that were read very much through a white lens. So they didn't think they were thinking about race, but by not thinking about race, they were thinking about race. So at the time, in the 80s, Jesse Jackson, of course, was running a very religiously based campaign. And the Christian right was very much opposed to Jesse Jackson. Not just because they were opposed to a black man in the White House. I think they would have said quite sincerely, oh no, we're not opposed to a black man in the White House. But they did not recognize Jesse Jackson's way of interpreting scripture as an authentic way to interpret scripture. They did not recognize his campaign as a moral campaign. And so that particular way of reading things was a white dominant lens. And so, yes, I think race needs to be considered, not in the simplistic way, not as, well, this is really just about trying to maintain segregated institutions, but rather in a lack of awareness of what the civil rights movement was really about, and a lack of understanding, perhaps, of the way that race functioned in American society.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to ask about your emphasis on single issue politics, which I think is a really well taken point. But I also wanted to ask about your engagement with the term Christian worldview, which I think is used in a lot of theologically conservative publications. I wonder if you associate that term more with Christian nationalism than you do with sort of evangelicals that you were talking about here.
Yeah. Well, so Christian worldview is kind of a complicated term because it originated in Reformed circles. So it can be traced back, I think, to the late 19th, early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century Dutch Calvinists. And so it comes from that wing, from the Calvinist wing of evangelicalism. And it really became popular in the late 20th century because of people like Francis Schaeffer, who were deeply shaped by Dutch Calvinist influenced presuppositionalism. And so Christian worldview, and now it's kind of pervaded all of evangelicalism, even evangelicals that are really not Calvinist at all, would adopt that worldview lens. But what it basically means is that we can't, in its traditional form, Christian worldview means that we are not reasoning from the same objective set of commonly shared assumptions anywhere, that secular people have their own set of assumptions and Christians should have their own set of assumptions that happen to be true. And so those assumptions start with biblical truth, they would say, and that you start with that as a foundation, and that becomes your lens of looking at reality. So someone, in talking about same-sex marriage, for instance, someone who's arguing from a Christian worldview standpoint probably wouldn't even feel the need to engage in arguments about, whether same-sex marriage is good for children or not. I mean, there's some arguments that people have made at times in the past that sort of appeal to a commonly shared sense of understanding, to say, okay, maybe there are some things we can agree on here, and we'll try to reason from within that perspective. Natural law arguments that many conservative Catholics gravitate toward are supposed to be arguments that can appeal across the philosophical spectrum and should appeal even to people who don't have a theistic belief. But a Christian worldview argument, which is now very popular among evangelicals, basically says, you have to, if you reason from a Christian worldview, you're reasoning from starting positions that may not even be accepted by the other side. So on its surface, Christian worldview language doesn't have to be political. It doesn't have to lead to Republican voting or any sort of voting. In practice, it does tend to be associated very strongly with conservatism, and also, I would argue, can be a shortcut for refusing to engage with certain arguments. So climate change, for example. Taken to its extreme, Christian worldview arguments can and have been used to basically dismiss evidence, to say, that's coming from a different worldview. And this is my worldview that's based on truth as I understand it, unchanging truth. So it doesn't have to be that way, but I do think that as Christians have gravitated, as conservative Christians have gravitated toward Christian worldview type language and Christian worldview type arguments, they have not been careful enough to preserve what I think is also a theologically orthodox Calvinist understanding of common grace. So theologically orthodox Calvinism with common grace theology would say that, sure, someone else may be unregenerate, but because of God's common grace, it doesn't mean that they don't have anything worth saying or that they can't reason, they can't observe the world. And at its extreme, Christian worldview is sometimes, not inevitably, but oftentimes been used to kind of dismiss perfectly reasonable, empirically based arguments that don't happen to fit with a set of presuppositions. So has it been used to reinforce Christian nationalism? Absolutely. Was it always used that way? No, but you can see where someone could go with that argument.
Between like William Jennings Bryan, like sober Democrat fundamentalism, and like maybe anti-immigration, like support is just like a general working class.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, my view, one of the things I've said about the Trumpist wing of the Republican Party is that it reminds me a lot of Jacksonianism in the 1820s. It's not identical, but there's a lot of shared similarity. And for all of the 19th century and into the 20th century, the Democratic Party was a white working class man's party. It was a party that wanted to expand democracy as they saw it among the white working class and restrict it for those for people of color. The Democratic Party was not anti-immigration in the early 20th century. In fact, far from it. They tended to rely very heavily on votes of Catholics in the North who were immigrants. So, but you can see the resemblances that there has historically been a connection between advancing the interests based on class and restricting the franchise based on race. We might wish that were not so, but that has more often than not been the reality. So I do see some correspondence there, and I do see very much a class-based dimension. Yeah, go ahead.
From the outside, when I see you spoke about very interesting, about the one subject kind of push. When people say, when I myself think about this is very hypocritical, meaning you want some people in political stands or the White House or whatever, but you wouldn't take those same guys to heaven with you, right? You don't want them in your heaven, but you want them there.
Yeah.
Is this something, do they see it as, am I wrong? Meaning, this is kind of, from many other religious perspectives that I know, there is some sort of holistic, the person needs to be holistically right in order to represent you, in order to push for the right. It is something very kind of utilitarian, like from their perspective, you really don't care about a specific person as long as they give us is like they're a tool, they're just a tool in their worldview. Or?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the answer is yes. So as I said, up until the late 1970s, there was this view that on the part of evangelical leaders that the president needed to be a Christian. I think they were unofficially applying a religious test for office, maybe in ways that are complicated with a constitutional prohibition on that, although you can argue individual voters have the right to impose their own test, even if the constitutionally you cannot as a society, but
can you try to convince them against that in a way? Or
yeah, but then I think what happened in the late 1970s was that the Christian right at least adopted the view of issues And this was coming from outside, it was coming from the idea of political PACs at the time, which were again, idea of pushing issues. It was done on both the left and the right. So, the Sierra Club, for example, didn't try to elect people who were avid hikers. They tried to elect people who would vote for environmental protection. And so when you began to see politics that way, each person in Congress is really just a sum total of their vote. I mean, you might wish the person didn't get arrested for driving under the influence or, engaging in or get some sort of scandal, engage in some sort of sex scandal. But in the end, the argument among all these PACs is, well, how do they vote? You're basically electing someone to vote for you. It's just it's sort of like direct democracy one step removed. You're electing a vote. And so some Christian right leaders approached Trump in that same way. I mean, I would argue, at least initially, that's how Al Mohler did in 2020. Basically said, Trump is this is a paraphrase, but essentially he basically said he's a reprehensible person. I didn't vote for him the first time. But I feel like I have to because it's the only, he did deliver, as he said repeatedly, basically, I didn't vote for him the first time because I didn't think he was going to give us the Supreme Court. But now in 2020 that he gave us the Supreme Court, I'm going to vote for him. So what he's basically saying is, I don't care about the character of the person in office. I view the presidency as a means to change the Supreme Court, which is a means to change abortion law or other things in the nation. And Trump has shown that actually he will give me that. So now I'll vote for him. Other people have voted for Trump in this other group, as I argued, who do view him as actually the sort of person they do want, who is, they're voting for him because he's taking on the establishment, not in spite of that. So I do think that on the part of the traditional Christian right, the evangelical leaders that were appealing to suburbanites, there was a very pragmatic, utilitarian, or kind of depersonalized view of politics as, it's all, in the end, it's all about how are people going to vote. Yeah.
So I think that pragmatism is present and underpins, I mean, in my reading, all of the single issues that you talked about. And I think that your final slide suggestion for a future is inadequate to address that, for the reason that I think in each of those cases there were evangelicals, whether they be a minority or not, saying these things, and it's not a smokescreen, it really did reflect a belief that it doesn't matter what the intention behind it was, because what they were saying is, you don't know well enough, so we need to put our forces, civil group behind legislation that will produce outcomes that will love our neighbor by taking away, by establishing prohibition or by maintaining slavery and segregation, right? Because the ideological justifications were secondary to this pragmatic tendency to generate and maintain and expand the hegemonic power systems that benefited the people who were part of evangelicalism.
Well, I guess we were all tempted by the idea that to justify the things that maintain our hegemonic power systems, we would like to think we're not, but we are tempted to do that. And so I wouldn't deny that people were, influenced by that even when they appear to be quite sincere. Some of the people I mentioned may not have been sincere, but I think many of them, as best as I can tell, probably were pretty sincere believers in that. I mean, I think William Jennings Bryan genuinely did believe that society would be better off if evolution were not taught in public schools. I think he was sincere on that point. I do believe that, yes, I mean, all these people are trying to love their neighbor. It's certainly the anti-abortion movement is, almost anyone in that would say that they are trying to love their neighbor, certainly the unborn neighbor, but even they would argue it's better for women, it's better for people as a whole if you don't have legal abortion. So it is a sincere belief. This view is not so much changing, is not really telling people individually how to vote. In fact, it's deliberately avoiding that. So I think someone could take this suggestion that I had and vote for Trump. I think someone could take the suggestion and vote for Biden. I think people could take this suggestion and vote third party. I mean, there are many ways to apply this. What I'm pushing back against, though, is a single issue vote as a litmus test for a movement to evaluate politics, to say, as the Christian right did for so long, abortion is our litmus test, and that is a higher priority than any other issue, and therefore, and we'll define abortion in this way, that is not just in terms of, what is likely to reduce abortion rates over the long term, or what is likely to be sort of holistically pro-life, but what is likely to make abortion illegal in the fastest way possible. And they're saying it's going to be the Supreme Court, and therefore it's going to be Republicans who are going to appoint these people, and so it becomes very much a litmus test view. And what I'm suggesting is that maybe we need to ask the larger question, okay, how do we love our neighbor? There are a lot of different things we need to consider, a lot of different facets. We're not all going to make the same choice, and that's okay. And actually, for most of evangelicalism's history, evangelicals as a whole did not make the same political choices. So the 1940s evangelicals, there were plenty of evangelical Democrats, there were plenty of evangelical Republicans. And if we could get back to that sort of thing, I think I wouldn't say all political choices are equal. And as an individual, I may feel strongly about my political choice and argue, in a personal conversation with someone, or even in my public writing, this is maybe a better political choice than others. But I would still resist the idea of linking Christianity as a whole, Christian faith, to a particular political agenda. And that's what I think happened in the late 1970s that was so detrimental to the public image, at least for evangelical theology, if not evangelical theology itself. But when it becomes linked to these single issue campaigns, apart from a holistic lens, it becomes cheapened in a way. So yeah, I mean, I would concede the point. This is not going to answer the question, how should I vote? But it is going to get people, I hope, to think about their own political choices as their best determination, given their limited options and their limited understanding of the situation. In other words, I don't have all political knowledge. I certainly don't have knowledge of the future. I'm going to take my best guess as to how to apply this principle, but I will allow for the fact that someone else acting in good faith, might make a different choice based on the same goal in mind. Okay. Yeah, maybe do you want to? Maybe we can just talk afterwards.
So thank you very much, Professor Williams.